We cannot talk about life at the turn of the century without also discussing the discrimination going on in the United States at this point in time. We see right after the end of Reconstruction, when the military pulled out of the South, that the South begins to immediately begin restrictions on African Americans, where they had a lot of gains during Reconstruction, mostly because the military was present. We see most of that come to an end after the military leaves the South. One of the biggest things that Southerners wanted to keep African Americans from doing was voting. They knew that if anyone votes, they're going to have more of a voice in their government and in their society, and they wanted to prevent that from happening. So one of the things we see is the institution of literacy test. A literacy test is where you had to be able to read and write in order to vote. This is going to specifically affect African Americans because if you remember from American History 1, at the end of the Civil War, when slavery is going to end, 80% of all African Americans were illiterate or could not read and write. So this is going to specifically target African Americans at the end of Reconstruction, because while many had learned to read and write, there were many, many more who could not read or write. Now, while this did mostly affect African Americans, it also affected many poor white Americans as well. So there's going to be other laws that were enacted to try to specifically target African Americans. Poll taxes is one of these examples. A poll tax is where you had to pay a tax in order to vote. Once again, many African Americans at this point in time were very, very poor, specifically in the South. Most of them were sharecroppers, so they really did not have the ability to pay any kind of tax. So again, targeting African Americans. Once again, however, this was not specifically just African Americans who were poor. Again, there were many white Americans who were also poor. So again, another law was enacted called the Grandfather Clause. A grandfather clause stated that your father or grandfather had to be able to vote on or before January 1st, 1863. Now, they picked this date specifically because this is when the Emancipation Proclamation was enacted. So before this date, most African Americans would have been slaves and therefore would not have been citizens and also would not have been allowed to vote. So this one specifically targeted African Americans to keep them from voting. So this, again, is going to be one of the many ways that they kept African Americans from voting in the South. Segregation is going to continue in the South as well, whereas before slaves were treated differently. Now we're going to see black codes enacted, as well as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are going to be laws that establish segregation. Basically, segregation is the separation of the races, and if you don't remember that, you should probably write that down. So we're basically going to begin starting separate facilities for African Americans and white Americans. So we'll see separate waiting rooms, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains as time goes on. So again, the separation of the races. The court case Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 had to do with a train car being separated, African Americans being required to sit in a separate train car. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to establish the separate but equal doctrine, basically stating that as long as the facilities were equal, that being separate was okay. So this is going to make segregation a fact of life in our country. It tells Americans that it's okay to have segregation practices. This is what is going to allow all of this segregation to continue and grow and build over time instead of it being stopped. So Plessy versus Ferguson is going to establish the separate but equal doctrine. There's something that develops in the United States called racial etiquette. Racial etiquette is a set of unwritten rules about how African Americans were supposed to behave while in the presence of white Americans. Things like African Americans were not supposed to look whites in the eye. We're always supposed to address them as sir or ma'am. And these were parts of how they were supposed to behave. So just like etiquette is how you're supposed to behave at a dinner table, racial etiquette is how they were supposed to behave while in the presence of whites. And we see that when some of these racial etiquette rules were broken, that you will have severe consequences in the South for those African Americans. Lynching specifically. Lynching is where it's usually a mob of people who kill someone for an alleged offense without a legal trial. In the South, this is going to happen to many, many African Americans. Usually the charge is rape, and there is usually no evidence proving that this alleged offense ever occurred. And usually when you talk about lynching, you are talking about killing someone by hanging them. So this is something that occurred quite frequently in the South. Ida B. Wells was one civil rights activist as well as a women's rights activist who is going to look into and document hundreds of lynchings that happen across the South, and she never finds any evidence to support those allegations that were made against these individuals. And this is something that happens all over. It is going to instill fear in many African Americans, specifically in the South, and is going to be carried out by members of the Ku Klux Klan and other white Americans in the South. And this was one way that they were able to control African Americans in the South, was through the fear that came about because of this type of behavior, this lynching. She winds up being run out of the South, again for her protection, because of what she was uncovering. Now, just because things were terrible in the South, we often think that things in the North were great. That is not the case. There was discrimination in northern cities. There was all of this segregation already in place there as well, but it just might not have been quite as violent as it was in the South. We're going to have two major civil rights activists that we're going to talk about today. The first is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was actually born a slave. He is going to go on to found Tuskegee Institute. Tuskegee Institute is going to be an institution whose main goal was to provide blacks with training in trade skills. Now, a trade school is going to be for vocational or occupational training, learning how to do a job, a specific skill like being a farmer or a brick mason, those types of actual job skills that they could perform in the community. Now, one of the things that made Booker T. Washington unique was that he argued for gradual improvement. He said that he recognized that this was going to be a process that took a long time, and that African Americans needed to work on economic equality first to prove that they were able to contribute to the economy and that they were economically equal first before they began working on social equality. So that's why he focused on that vocational training or occupational training. Okay, so vocation is what you do for a job, your occupation, it's the same thing. So that was the whole goal of the Tuskegee Institute. In his Atlanta Compromise, he talks about how African Americans and whites could cooperate on economic issues, basically work together, work side by side, without ever actually having to acknowledge that they were socially equals, that they could continue in segregation basically for a period of time, and that this would happen over time and be a very slow and gradual process. Now, he is going to be criticized heavily by a man named W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was Harvard educated, and this shows you he's the first African American to receive a degree from Harvard. He is obviously, because of this, going to stress higher education. He believed in a principle called the talented 10th, basically where the top 10% of the African American community should go on to be educated, and then after they were educated at a higher institution, that they would come back to their communities and continue to help the others be educated as well. So higher education and continuing that type of learning would be very important to W.E.B. Du Bois. Whereas Booker T. Washington looked at gradual equality, W.E.B. Du Bois demanded full equal rights now, or immediate equality. He said this should not be a long process, that their rights had been denied them for many, many years and many generations, and that this should be given to them now. So really they have different ideas. At the Niagara Falls Convention, he is one of, I believe, 9 Americans who go on to found the NAACP, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So this organization is going to continue to fight for the full rights of African Americans. Now, while we were mostly talked about African Americans today, there was discrimination going on in other places. Mexican seasonal workers were often put into something called debt peonage, where if they had any debts, they were basically put into a form of slavery for a period of time. So they are going to be discriminated against as well. The Chinese, for example, also faced a tremendous amount of discrimination. Many of them were not even allowed into the United States, and those that were really discriminated against. There was a tremendous amount of resentment against them, in specifically closer to the west in the United States. But still, there's a lot of discrimination going on with all minorities at this point in American history.